Welcome to the Holistic Living Podcast, my beautiful friends. You can expect my uncensored, real, and honest thoughts on a wide variety of health topics. If you love to learn on ways to improve your health, your life, your mindset, your emotions, and everything in between in a natural way, you are in the right place, and I am so excited to have you here. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 12 of the Holistic Living Podcast. Today, I am talking about irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. I'm going to help you understand what's actually happening when you have IBS, whether it's IBS C or D, and also give you some insights on what you can do to help relieve it. This podcast is a bonus episode. You guys have been asking for more than one episode a week, so I'm going to do my best to deliver and get you guys more than one a week. So this is a bonus one. I hope you enjoy. Let's dive in. So the number of people developing IBS or SIBO or IBD, things like Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, diverticulitis, it is rapidly increasing within North America, India, and other parts of the world. Our food supply is incredibly polluted with pesticides and herbicides and all kinds of chemicals, and our food is laced with genetically modified ingredients and sugars, hydrogenated oils, and every kind of crazy ingredient you can think of. Our lifestyles are so fast-paced, there's no rest. Everyone's always just going from one event to the next, one task to the next. Our sleep cycles are all over the place, with most people staying up well past 2 a.m. You can begin to see why we as a race are having so many difficulties with our health. So my goal with this podcast is it's intended to give you some new information that you might not have heard about before in regards to IBS, SIBO, and leaky gut. And I'm hoping that you will finish listening to this podcast with a lot more understanding of this condition. And if you do have this condition or one of these conditions, you have a better understanding of what's actually going on. So you can develop intestinal imbalances from many different ways. A few of the common ways are dysbiosis. So, an overgrowth of yeast or fungus or parasites, bacteria, viruses, etc. Brain inflammation from a head injury. So if you had a concussion, for example, that creates a lot of gut inflammation. I won't go into too much detail on this specific topic because I've touched on it before and I'll be touching on it again in the future, but we have a vagal nerve. It connects our gut and our brain together. And so whenever there's inflammation in the brain, likewise, there will then be inflammation in the gut. And if there is gut inflammation, again, there will then be brain inflammation because of the connection with that vagal nerve. You can look more into this topic if you're interested. I have so much information on the vagus nerve and how it works and how it affects our brain and our gut through my YouTube and Instagram channels. So all my outlets have content around that if you're interested. But again, some of the ways that we can develop a gut imbalance is from pathogenic overgrowth, brain inflammation, anxiety, a concussion, chronic stress. Chronic stress, again, creates that brain inflammation, which creates gut inflammation. This is why people who are stressed out often will end up with stomach cramping. Or if you are about to go and give a public speech and you are super nervous to speak in public, you start to get nauseous in the stomach, or you start to have some kind of butterfly feeling. That's that gut-brain connection, that vagal nerve connection. Ingestion of toxic substances, whether it's medications, drugs, GMO foods, high fructose corn syrup, like these really toxic ingredients, food colorings, pesticides, things like that. These will also contribute to gut imbalances. And then, of course, things we're putting on our skin. This is so important because a lot of people don't realize whatever we're putting on our skin is actually absorbing into our bloodstream and is absolutely going to affect our gut and the probiotics that we have there. So if you are using products that have triclosan or, phthalates or all these fragrances and things like that, these are all absorbing into our bloodstream and is, of course, going to cause some issues there. Our drinking water is really important to mention here because a lot of water throughout different parts of the world has lots of chlorine, which is really damaging to the probiotics in our gut. It has heavy metals. It's got other toxins. So just lots of things that are going to cause that gut inflammation. So again, with some of these different things that I just mentioned, whether it's, again, brain inflammation from a concussion or dysbiosis or bad foods or drinking water or medications, things like that, these are some of the many ways you can develop a gut imbalance. So if you took many rounds of antibiotics and have no beneficial flora left, so no good probiotics, the opportunistic pathogens within the intestinal system, for example, candida or fungus or mold or parasites, they will overgrow and they will infect the colon. This triggers chronic inflammation in the intestines because these pathogens secrete histamine, they tear up the gut lining, they destroy your mucosal membranes, which causes food sensitivities, which causes more cytokines to be released and therefore more inflammation. So there's a lot happening. And so when you have this chronic inflammation in the intestines, it leads to IBS, which is an inflammatory condition within the bowels. If you had a head injury and now you have brain inflammation, the vagus nerve, which connects the gut and the brain, does not fire effectively, and you end up with poor vagal motor nerve outflow. This means that every time you eat a meal, you won't have signals from the brain to the digestive organs to secrete enzymes. And over time, this leads to a loss of what we call oral tolerance of food, and you end up developing food sensitivities, which trigger inflammation and IBS flares. If you are chronically stressed, your immune system, your Th1 cells get suppressed and your Th2 immune cells rapidly produce. And these Th2 immune cells lead to chronic inflammation and tissue destruction. When you have tissue destruction within the intestinal system, your body literally is damaging its own gut lining, causing IBD and really, severe inflammatory symptoms. And eventually, your IBS will transition more so into IBD, or at least become a lot more intense. There's many other ways in which you can develop IBS, but what I just mentioned, these are just a few common ones. Now, before I continue here, I do want to say a lot of people, do not classify IBS as an autoimmune, but it is in fact an autoimmune condition in the sense that it is autoinflammatory. So it is a direct result of having too much inflammation in the gut and then an overactive or overexcited immune system in terms of the Th2 and the Th17 side of things, causing you to have higher inflammatory cytokine levels, higher inflammation in general. So this is, in fact, an autoinflammatory condition and is classified as autoimmune. And if you speak to many functional medicine doctors, practitioners, etc., they will also confirm. There's also a lot of leading immunologists who are now seeing IBS as an autoimmune condition and kind of addressing it as such. So I just wanted to note that. So just what I just mentioned in regards to pathogens causing inflammation, and then if you have brain inflammation that can cause, a lack of release of enzymes, this is always the starting point. Imagine if you're eating a meal and your liver is not secreting enough pancreatic enzymes or bile, your stomach is not secreting enough stomach acid. How are you supposed to actually break down that meal? You're not. And so a few things happen. If you don't break down that meal properly, first of all, you're going to have nutrient deficiencies because you're not actually getting those micronutrients from that meal and then assimilating it and absorbing it into the body. But more importantly, that means food is going to be sitting in the intestinal system for a lot longer than it should. So number one, if things are moving through you slower, you can expect constipation. If you have constipation and if food is sitting in there longer trying to break down, it's going to cause inflammation, and then the pathogens that are in the gut are going to feed off of this food that's sitting in the gut, and they're going to ferment it, and so you'll have gas and bloating, most likely, or at least a lot of abdominal discomfort. If you have a lot of inflammation and you eat a meal and you're now sensitive to certain ingredients, it might trigger loose stools or major diarrhea because the body is trying to get rid of it quickly. The body has lost its oral tolerance, which is an acceptance of a foreign substance in the body. Food is really the only foreign thing that our body should be accepting and not seeing as a harm or a threat and not attacking. So when we typically are in good health, we can eat foods and our body has good oral tolerance, so it's not reacting negatively to these foods. But as we lose our oral tolerance over time, from all the ways that I just mentioned, your body starts to see food as a threat, as a pathogen, as something that needs to be killed, destroyed, eliminated. So if you eat a meal, say you're sensitive to dairy and you're eating dairy, your body is going to try to get that out as fast as possible. And that's where the diarrhea portion of IBS comes in. If you have IBSD and you're having multiple bowel movements a day, or you're eating something and then suddenly need to rush to the bathroom because you have really bad cramping and are about to have some loose stools, that's a good indication that something you just ate elevated your inflammation levels enough to signal your immune system to come in and try and get rid of whatever you just ate. So losing your oral tolerance is a huge part, and having good enzyme production. These are huge things to look into rebalancing, and a huge part of what we want to be doing when trying to reverse IBS. You need to increase your enzyme levels. You need to break down that food better so your body is having an easier time with digestion, and so food's not sitting in you as long. But of course, at the same time, you want to make sure you're working on rebuilding and reestablishing that oral tolerance. Otherwise, everything you're going to be eating, you're going to react to, and these reactions get stronger, and more new ones will follow as well. So you'll start to find that maybe before you were sensitive to 2 things, now it seems like everything you're eating, you're reacting to. Okay, so moving on, systemic inflammation leads to brain inflammation, which makes you lose vagal motor tone, and you then lose that down going peristalsis, that down movement where things are moving downwards in the body. You lose this in the intestines once you have poor vagal motor outflow. So chronic stress causes this. Whenever we have brain inflammation, whether again, it could be from a concussion, it could be from too much stress, whatever the reason, once you have that poor vagal motor outflow, you start to lose that downward motion. Now, this downward motion, which we call motility of the intestines, is what keeps your bowel movements regular, and it keeps the probiotics in the large intestine. It keeps them down where you want them. As you start to lose this motility, bacteria from the large intestine, probiotics as well, will start to creep up to the small intestine. So things start to move upwards because you've lost that downward peristalsis. And, probiotics or pathogens creeping up into the small intestine will trigger epithelial inflammation and NF-kappa B, which is an inflammatory cytokine. It'll increase NF-kappa B production in the epithelial lining of the intestine. This will then drive systemic inflammation, and, you can also get systemic inflammation from pollen or a high ozone day, a hot sunny day, and then that can set off this whole inflammatory mechanism as well. But either way, once you have this continuance of this inflammatory cytokine production, you end up with more inflammation. And then brain inflammation inhibits vagal motor nerve outflow, which yields you a loss of acetylcholine-mediated inhibition of TNF-alpha in the intestines and the spleen, which essentially makes you lose your anti-inflammatory effects, which then again reinforces systemic inflammation. So if you're not understanding a lot of these terms, don't stress. The point here is that once you lose that downward peristalsis or that motility, things start to move upwards. Pathogens will start to come up. You'll start having that bloating. You'll start having that inflammation. You might even start to get reflux, heartburn, things moving upwards because you've lost that downward peristalsis. But SIBO is one of the most common things that people get once they start to lose their peristalsis. And then as you have these different things moving upwards, poor digestion, pathogens, etc., and you have all this inflammation, you start to have more secretion of NF-kappa B, which is that inflammatory cytokine, and you also start to lose your acetylcholine-mediated inhibition of TNF-alpha, which we need in order to, prevent this loop of inflammation, if that makes sense. So in a person who has lost their downward motility, they will get the development of SIBO, which is that small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And if the inflammation is the primary cause, then in susceptible individuals, they might develop IBD, like Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. So if this inflammation is persistent, if nothing is done to stop or inhibit or prevent this inflammation, the condition, SIBO, or the IBS that they have can progress into something more serious like Crohn's which is really important to know because a lot of times they'll say, you have Crohn's. It's something that you just have to live with. It's something that you were going to get no matter what you did. But really, that's not true. We know it's caused by inflammation, and there are ways that we can inhibit that inflammation. Okay, so there's a research article from Othman et al. In 2010, and it states that individuals with IBS usually have disturbed neural function, so anxiety, depression, irritability, along the gut-brain axis. They also have chronic low-grade inflammation and immunological alterations in the development of symptoms compatible with IBS. They usually have infections in the gut too, from candida, parasites, viruses, etc. So I just wanted to share that little clip. I would recommend looking into that article from I think it's Ohman, Ohman, so Ohman et al. 2010. It's a great article on IBS and kind of what's happening, and I think everyone should read it. So types of IBS. What types of IBS are there? So there are two types of IBS. You have IBS-D, which is IBS diarrhea, and IBS-C, which is IBS constipation. Some people can have both at the same time. They can have a hard time having bowel movements, but then all of a sudden, a few days later, they're having some nonstop. So you can have both together as well. Depending on the type of bacteria that you have in your intestines, this is what can determine the type of stool or IBS that you will have. If you have flora in your intestines that produce methane, you will lean more towards IBS constipation. But if you have hydrogen-producing flora, you will have more IBS diarrhea. If you have both bacteria, you will tend to alternate between diarrhea and constipation. So let's talk about some dietary evidence. There is evidence that being gluten-free and following a low FODMAP diet can be useful for IBS. This is coming from Che W. et al. 2015. They did an amazing article on this and on the benefits of being gluten-free when you have IBS. The most important thing to do when you develop IBS is to cut out all inflammatory foods, including gluten, dairy, cane sugar, yeast, peanut butter, because it's moldy, so any moldy or histamine-forming foods, alcohol, coffee, cut it out. I know this can sound so overwhelming, you guys, and I'm not going to make this whole podcast all about what foods to cut out. I have so much content around that already, but what I will say is that typically if you go really strict and avoid all the inflammatory foods for a period of time, you can introduce some of them back and enjoy them on occasion without having a flare. But until we shut down inflammation in the gut by cutting out anything that can add to that inflammation, you cannot reverse the IBS. So that's where removing the foods will come in handy, because you can take supplements and you can do a lot of things to help your IBS. But if you are still eating inflammatory foods, your inflammation in the gut will persist, making it very difficult for you to actually get results. I have a whole guide walking you step by step on what to cut out, what to eat, what to avoid, what supplements to take. So a full candida, parasite, and gut protocol for this condition. And I will link it in the description of this podcast. It is incredible. Thousands of people have used it to help reverse their skin issues, their gut issues, IBS, things like that. So if you're looking for more information on what foods specifically to cut out, for how long, how to go about all of this, that will be in the description. And it is such a great program, and I think can be a really great starting point if you have no clue where to start. But moving on, once you've successfully calmed down your inflammation in the digestive tract and cleared it out of most of the pathogens, you can then begin working on resealing the gut lining. So what I always recommend is when I start working with clients who have IBS, this is kind of where I specialize in IBS and skin issues. The first thing I say is we need to rid. We want to rid the body of inflammatory foods. We want to rid the body of pathogens in the gut, so do a pathogen cleanse. We want to rid the body of toxins, of inflammation, etc. Once you've successfully done that, you typically will feel so much better. Your bowel movements, your IBS flares will be much more regulated, if completely non-existent at all. And then from there, we start to repair. So that's where we go from the rid phase to the repair phase. The repair phase is where we repair the gut lining that's been damaged. We repair the immune system that's been damaged and everything that needs to be rebuilt in the body. And then the final phase is the replace phase. And this is where we replace nutrient deficiencies, lots of probiotics, prebiotics, all that good stuff, enzymes, etc. Working within the rid, repair, replace outline is how you will get lasting results from your IBS. So that's what my program does, is it goes through the rid, repair, replace phases, takes you step by step through with what supplements you need to take, includes liver cleansing and all that good stuff along with it, what foods to eat, what things to avoid. So it's a perfect program to just walk you step by step if you're not sure where to go or what to do. Okay, it is important to note that if you go gluten-free, you need to consider avoiding gluten cross-reactors as well, like yeast, millet, rice, etc. You can get a full ELISA, IgG, and IgA test to determine your sensitivities and what gluten cross-reactors are a trigger for you. So definitely ask your practitioner about getting that done. If you continue to eat these foods, it will trigger IBS symptoms and prevent you from resealing your gut lining and lowering inflammation. So it's so important to cut out the gluten and dairy and sugar, yeast, all those things. Again, read the article from Che W. et al. 2015. It's incredible, and they found that individuals avoiding gluten had a higher rate of improvement in their IBS than those that didn't. The most common marker for IBS is going to be either overgrowth of bad bacteria or inadequate growth of favorable flora. So you want to make sure while you're ridding the body of everything, while you're removing all the inflammatory foods, while you're killing off pathogens and lowering that inflammation, you want to be clearing out the bad bacterial overgrowth. And then after that's done, then you can start bringing in those good probiotics to support the favorable growth of good probiotics. Okay, so moving on, are breath tests accurate for SIBO and IBS? This is interesting, so definitely listen up to this. A breath test is where you can consume lactulose and then capture air samples to see if there is a production of hydrogen or methane. The sugar solution is used to promote the proliferation of the flora that produced the gas, which then gets absorbed into the bloodstream and gets off-gassed by the lungs to create detection opportunity in the test. Most of the time, the test comes back normal when you in fact do have IBS or SIBO. And I want to stress that here because I know so many people who said, we took a breath test and it came back negative, so I don't have this issue. These tests can be somewhat expensive, and the common clinical experience is that when a person has a lot of gas and bloating, the breath test will come out abnormal, which means you have SIBO. So essentially, you spend a lot of money to determine if you have gas and bloating, which you could tell yourself without spending the money on the test. And sometimes if you go for a breath test and it comes back normal or negative, despite the fact that you have the obvious symptoms of bloating, of IBS, of SIBO, what often happens in this case is that the sugar solution that you had drank, that the person drank, simply is not the solution that the predominant flora are going to consume to drive their proliferation. If this is the case, you will get a negative breath test. So overall, these tests are expensive and I think quite inaccurate. And so I personally am not a huge fan of the breath test. It can work, but you're going to spend a lot of money to get a positive result when you already know you have gas and bloating and those IBS symptoms, or you might get a false negative, but you still have the symptoms and you still want to be working on the gut because you have the symptoms. So either way, I think, if you do choose to get it, just take it with a grain of salt, understand what's actually happening when you're getting that breath test done. And if it does come back negative, do not assume that you do not have IBS or SIBO. You really want to go off your symptoms here. All right, so let's talk about some bad reactions against good bacteria. Just as it is inappropriate to have a negative reaction against food, it is also inappropriate to have a bad reaction against favorable bacteria. However, it can happen, especially with leaky gut. Our bodies are not supposed to be reacting negatively to food or flora, but oftentimes it does, which is oftentimes why a person might feel worse when supplementing with probiotics. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because I have a lot of clients who do have IBS and SIBO, and no matter what we try, they cannot take probiotics. So I wanted to share this little tidbit of information. Microbiota instability and significant differences in bacterial composition, mainly reduced lactobacilli and bifidobacteria, and elevated aerobe to anaerobe ratios makes the IBS get worse and flare up. So large amounts of bacterial concentrations that adhere to the mucosal surface, which is those biofilms of the gut, they trigger a lot of inflammation. And so these bacterial colonies form a structure in which the bacteria are embedded into the lining of the gut, which makes them highly resistant to antifungals and other supplements, therefore making them very difficult to eradicate. In IBS, more bacteria adhere to the mucosal wall, which makes the IBS very persistent and chronic. So in this situation, when somebody has IBS, essentially what I'm trying to say here is that IBS is usually very heavily involved with biofilms. So that just means that it's going to be very hard to eradicate the infection. I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with where we have been doing antifungals and crazy supplements for like 6 to 10 months, and they still had the exact same symptoms. Not because things weren't working, but because those biofilms were so hard to damage and destroy so that we could actually hit the bacteria within the biofilms. So it can take time. If you have had this condition for a very long time, if you have had antibiotics for a long time, you cannot expect to get quick results with IBS. And at the same time, you can't expect to just take a probiotic and have it all fixed. You might actually react negatively to the probiotics. If your body has lost that oral tolerance, it might see these beneficial probiotics as a problem and try to kill them off as well. So what we want to be doing before I go to the conclusion of this podcast is work within rid, repair, replace. Before you work on starting to bring in probiotics or bring in nutrients or all these other things, let's first start by getting rid of stuff. Let's get rid of those foods that we know are causing a problem, those foods that we know are going to elevate our inflammation. This is usually the hardest part for people, is to change their diet and stop the cravings. So this is the part where it's going to take the longest. Start minimizing your sugar. Start minimizing your gluten and dairy consumption. Start ditching and swapping. So cut out gluten for gluten-free products, as long as they're clean. You want to cut out dairy and start using coconut-based products. You want to cut out sugar and start trying like a liquid stevia or something like that. So make the switches once you're comfortable with avoiding all of these inflammatory foods. And again, you can get a full list in my guide, which is linked in the description of the podcast. Once you've cut out those foods and you are like, I've got this, you can then really start coming in with antifungals, liver cleansing supplements, things to start targeting those biofilms, things to start killing those pathogens so we can lower histamine, lower inflammation, lower those inflammatory cytokines. Once we've done that and you are feeling so much better, you can then start repairing, start getting in there with gelatin and marshmallow root and all these great repairing herbs and remedies to fix and soothe the gut lining. Then finally, this is where your oral tolerance should already be so much better. And so bringing in probiotics in that final stage, in that replace stage, is where you can get the probiotics in without reacting to them negatively, typically. And you can also bring in other things you were deficient in as well and would absorb them really good, because now you have a nice, strong, healthy gut lining versus inflammation. So rid, repair, replace. For the full, complete breakdown of what needs to be done, you can again find that in my guide. It is so affordable. You can get 2 for the price of 1 right now in the bundle, and it will help you kickstart your IBS reversal journey. It works, of course, on SIBO as well. I hope that this podcast gave you a bit more information as to why you have IBS in terms of how it works, the inflammation, the vagal motor part of it as well, how it affects your body. Everyone tells you that IBS is due to leaky gut, but that is not necessarily the case, and it is not the full picture. It is much more intricate than that, and it really comes down to, again, a lot of inflammation. And why do we have inflammation? That's the $1 million question. Oftentimes it's coming from diet. Oftentimes it's from too many antibiotics or medication usage. Oftentimes it's coming from too much alcohol consumption, from chronic stress, which we know destroys the gut. Oftentimes it could be a brain injury. It could be brain inflammation from anxiety or depression, and so much more. So we want to look at the whole picture. We want to say, we know you have inflammation. We know that there's pathogenic overgrowth. We know that food probably played a role in this. We know that stress probably played a role in this. But how do we reverse it? Let's start by getting rid of inflammation. So any way you can minimize inflammation, and that's not just with diet and taking antifungals. It is also managing stress, practicing deep breathing, removing stressful things from your life, doing transcutaneous vagal nerve stimulation. I have a whole YouTube video explaining exactly what that is. I also have a guide on my website, holisticspring.com, under the ebooks tab, going over exactly what TVNS is and how to use it, how to do it. It is so affordable. I think everyone should be doing it to stimulate our vagus nerve. It is so anti-inflammatory. It's going to help with constipation, with diarrhea, with SIBO, with IBS, with anxiety, and all the other things. So there's so much you can do. And that's what's important is don't just say, oh, I have leaky gut. I'm going to go take gelatin and L-glutamine and I'm good to go, because that will not fix your IBS. You first need to rid, then you need to repair, then you need to replace. I'm going to be doing another podcast in the near future, going through step by step, more in depth on the rid, repair, replace and what that entails. But I do have a lot of YouTube videos breaking it down as well if you're interested. Either way, thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you got some good takeaways from this. I hope you enjoyed this bonus episode. Please let me know if you have any questions. You can reach me through my social media. If you ever want to work together, you can also contact me through my website, and I would love to work with you. So thank you so much for taking a little time out of your day to listen to this podcast. I hope you have a beautiful day or night wherever you are listening from, and I will talk to you in the next one. Bye.